Good afternoon, everybody. It is my absolute pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to Dr. Lorraine Hammond, who is our Chit Chat for this afternoon. We've been very fortunate, Dr. Hammond, for the last 2 weeks to have two incredible experts, and our Chit Chats have been very close together. So you're following on from an amazing chat last week with Dr. Anita Archer, which has been, I'm sure, a beautiful segue into what we are going to discuss this afternoon about explicit direct instruction, the implementation of the science of reading and structured literacy in schools in Australia, and the changes that you've observed over the last 10 years. And I know we're going to get a lot of fantastic tips and tools to walk away. So welcome. It's really wonderful to have you joining us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Carla, for the opportunity.
So Dr. Lorraine Hammond is an Associate Professor in the School of Education at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia. Lorraine has worked and researched in the area of early literacy, high impact instructional strategies, including explicit teaching and learning difficulties since 1990. Graduating as a secondary English teacher, Lorraine specialised in the field of learning differences and began her postgrad studies in this area. She has completed her master's and PhD on the prevention of reading and spelling difficulties, and in 2002 was awarded a Churchill Fellowship. In 2016, Lorraine was recognised by the Australian Government with a University Teaching Award for outstanding tertiary teaching, and in 2017, the Australian Council for Educational Leadership recognised her work in schools promoting high impact instruction. In 2019, Lorraine received an Order of Australia for her significant contribution to tertiary education and the community. Wow, I just have to put that wow in there right now.
Thank you.
Lorraine is the president of Learning Difficulties Australia and the chair, deputy chair and board member of 3 high-performing WA schools, of which I have been very privileged to visit one of. Since 2017, Lorraine has developed and presented professional learning on evidence-based literacy strategies for the Kimberley Schools project in the north of Western Australia in remote community schools. In 2021, she commenced work with Catholic Education, Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn on Catalyst, I hope I'm saying that correctly, a project underpinned by the science of reading and the science of learning. It is an absolute privilege to have you joining with us this afternoon to share some of your insights into evidence-based literacy, explicit direct instruction, structured literacy and the science of reading, and the impact that is having to many children under your watch.
Thank you.
So shall we begin our chit chat this afternoon with you sharing some of what you have observed over the past 10 years in terms of literacy development, and I'm going to say progress in Australia.
Progress. Well, I'm very fortunate, Carla, to work across Australia. So I have a broad brush view of what's been happening. I will say that there is good instruction everywhere in Australia, but there's more good instruction in Western Australia, and I've watched that quite closely. As you would be aware, there's a lot of high-performing schools in Western Australia, and there are examples in every other state of schools like that. It's just that we have more of them. And, you know, back in 2007, it really began, and I was pregnant with my son. And I remember going to a session that Sir Jim Rose from the UK had come to run, and that was through Learning Difficulties Australia. And he talked about the need to change literacy practice, and that there were 3 principals in the room who I didn't know, but they looked at what happened and they listened to some other speakers, and they were like, yeah, we can do this. And off they went. And by 2010, they'd already started to get some really good results through teaching phonics explicitly. Then there was a report conducted because quite a number of schools had jumped on board, and I'll make the point that if you want to do it, it's good to have some pilot schools, and these 3 or 4 schools were literally pilot schools, and more got involved. And in 2015, there was a report that examined what was going on in these schools, because they were all schools in relatively low socioeconomic areas, and they were outperforming schools in much better suburbs, for want of a better term. And so 3 things they had in common. They all taught reading really well, according to, I guess, what we would call now a version of the science of reading. It probably wasn't as tight as we talk about now, but they all taught phonics, and they went about it in a very structured and explicit way. They all had low variation curriculums. And this is a really big deal, because when you start on any journey to change teachers' practice, you've got to give them a really clear structure on what to do. And I'll probably say this a number of times today. I work on a 10% rule. You can't ask teachers to do more than 10% on top of what they're already doing, otherwise it's too hard. And so these schools developed a low variation scope and sequence, which meant that if it was term 3, day 1, we would be teaching the following if we were both in year 2. And so it gave teachers learning objectives and said, this is what we would like you to teach. And then the final thing was that these principals were all very stable. And that's really important too. You need principals who are stable in the school and remain in the school for an extended period of time. So that really was an important stage in WA's development, because then, of course, there were pilot schools. And at uni at the time, I'd always been teaching units on direct instruction, the scripted one, and explicit instruction, the unscripted one. Getting traction in schools was really hit and miss. But then suddenly there were a bunch of schools who were prepared to do it, because, no teacher goes to school wanting to, make a child's life miserable. They all want the best for their students. It's an altruistic profession. We don't do it for the money. So teachers started to jump on board, and so did schools. And they wanted what other schools had. And a number of schools rang me. I remember one particular school, the principal rang me and said, look, I just want what this other school's got. Can you make that happen? And I said, well, I can. And it was interesting, because then I met that particular principal, and he said to me, because I said, look, if we're going to work together, this is a bit of a game plan. And then he said to me, oh, but I don't like, this particular thing. And I said, yeah, I know, but it's not for you, it's for your children. And so I think that, when we talk about that process of somebody taking up anything new, they have to see what it looks like. They really do have to see whether it's going to work. So those pilot schools were fantastic in WA, because as a result of those schools in WA, quite a number of my colleagues from the East Coast came and had a look, and you've got to see what it looks like. So if we look at the work that I do in the Kimberley, which is 24 schools, and we all in those schools do some professional learning around the science of reading and the science of learning, because we run an explicit model. I now do exactly the same thing in Canberra, in arguably some of the most socially advantaged schools in the nation. So the pedagogy is precisely the same. So, I can't commend the Catholic education system in Canberra more for literally turning around and saying, no, we now know that balanced literacy is not working, it's not serving our needs, and taking up the research-informed practice that they now are. And of course, there are pockets all over the place of really good practice, but sometimes they're pockets, and it's really hard to work in isolation. And interestingly, other systems, so I know that in New South Wales, my colleagues at the Association for Independent Schools have worked very hard to bring around explicit instruction in their early literacy. But again, we're often talking about pockets. Perhaps we're a little luckier than you in the sense that AITSL, which is the overarching body that looks at what universities do, have said to universities now, and I was very fortunate to be part of a review team that supported the Federal Ministry of Education in Australia and AITSL to say, well, actually, we need a whole unit on beginning literacy, beginning reading, and it needs to contain the following. And so, again, with that 10% rule in mind, we now have sample unit plans for lecturers who themselves, like any other teacher, would no doubt find that the rug had been pulled from underneath them if one day they then had to suddenly turn and do something different. Yeah. So I think in Australia, and certainly in Western Australia, there's been a number of factors. The fact that we've had these principals who went out on a limb, they really did go out on a limb, and it was not easy for them. because at the time it was very balanced literacy. And a lot of the people who had produced some of the materials are called First Steps, which are part of what WA actually produced, which was very constructivist. This was an approach, and that's what my master's and PhD was all about, that said, look, don't teach letter sounds, teach letter names because they're constant. And then, I know further down the track, it was like, oh, and get kids to sound out words. If they can't figure it out any other way, they can sound it out. Well, of course, the poor kids have never been taught letter sounds, let alone how to decode. So, as with education systems, the authors of these materials who had been promoted had then found themselves into positions of power within the educational jurisdictions, whether it's, the independent school system or the government school system or the Catholic school system. And it's very hard to let go of something that you're a big part of. So in the early days, those principals, and I did as well, really struggled because we were very much in the minority. But then, along comes changes to ACARA. So I'm sorry, to AITSL, and of course, well, hopefully to the new Australian curriculum as well, which I've had some things to say about, which isn't great right now, but hopefully we can put that in line with what universities are now required to teach. We have an explosion of social media. I mean, we're connecting now. I met you before.
Absolutely.
Be connecting others. Yes, and, we have a Science of Reading in Schools Facebook page that has, its 3 founding members in WA, and they have over 37,000 people in that Facebook group. So you think of the pressure that starts to apply when teachers are suddenly able to access research, which was pretty hard to get your hands on, even these days. You might go through Google Scholar, but you really got to know what you're looking for. So suddenly it's become far more accessible, this knowledge. And I think teachers, certainly in Western Australia, feel far more empowered now, and so do principals. And, I work with principals now who 5 years ago wouldn't have, spat on me if I was on fire, who now are realising that if they don't jump on board, they're not going to be part of what is a significant change movement. And certainly within Western Australia, within the government system, we have a Director General of Education who previously worked in New Zealand, who is very pro-research. So she has a strong sense that it needs to be according to what the evidence says. And so that has further, I think, enabled teachers to align their practice and feel confident that that's a good thing to do.
So as you're talking, I'm sort of banking all of these little bits and pieces of what you're saying, and I want to come right back to, there's a couple of really amazing key points for us here in New Zealand in terms of what you've said. The first thing that I want to acknowledge is that if there was ever a time for us to capitalise on the fact that we are a consensus-based profession, it potentially is right now, to get into those pilot schools where this practice is really, really well embedded. So I think what you've been sharing with us is that you built up that practice with a group of teachers in WA, and then as a result, others came. And so you know, that sort of groundswell just really started and extended from there. You mentioned very, very early on that the schools that do this well have, your exact term was more good instruction. And by that, I'm thinking you're meaning their instruction was just that much more sophisticated than other instruction. You then went on to say that there are 3 key things that these schools have in common in terms of being a high-performing school in this area. One is that their teaching is very structured and explicit. The second is that there is a low variation of curriculum. And it's this point that I'd like for us just to pick up and explore a little bit further, because one of the things that I know people, our participants from New Zealand will have honed in on when you were talking, was when you said that you might have a class of Year 2 students and they come into a particular time of teaching and this is what is to be taught. I think that New Zealand teachers are incredibly proud of their ability to differentiate through their instruction, and for me to be able to teach this group of learners who is here and this group of learners who is here. Could you talk to us a little bit more about how, when you implement a low variation curriculum, you're able to still meet the varied needs of the learners.
Well, it's a good point that you make. If I look to what happens in the Kimberley, where you couldn't have a more diverse group of learners, so you might be sitting in a Year 2 class and have children who can't read anything, right the way through to children who are at a Year 2 level, maybe at a Year 3 level. So there's always going to be variation. We know this. What happens when you run an explicit model is you have predetermined what it is you're going to teach. So, you know, we work from the Australian curriculum, we then drill down and we look at the particular scope and sequence that you happen to have hitched your wagon to. And it really doesn't matter, they're all the same, ostensibly the same. You know, you've got 4 years to build the reading circuitry in the human brain for reading. So let's go about this in a systematic manner. So by the time we're in Year 2, we've definitely picked up all the most basic code, for want of a better term, and we're now into really a reinforcement of the most common code, knowing that the human brain is a lot smarter than we give it credit for. It's a lot of implicit learning going on. You know, most of the words that you and I can read, we were never taught. So we're just trying to bed down the most commonly occurring letter sound relationships. And so in a Year 2 classroom, we'd have a scope and sequence. And so let's imagine that we were doing IGH, and that would have been taught previously, but it's turned up again. So what that means is all children will do a review on IGH. So I'll point to IGH and I'll say IGH, IGH, I as in, and then we'll start reading some words. And so we'll start with might and we'll start with light, and then we'll end up on frighten. Now, what that means is everybody in the class has read all those words, and there might be 10 words, and there'll be some aspirational words in there as well as some very easy words, relatively speaking. But you and I will read all those together if you're in my class. And then I'll say, okay, I'll read it, you read it. And then I'll say, okay, Carla, you're my most able student. You're going to be reading frightening, but I'm going to have a child there who's still going to be reading sight. So when we differentiate at the point of individual need. It's just not possible to have 6 groups of children, as some people tell me that they try to manage in one class. And you're over there, and of course, you know, it's only 5 days in a week, so some people I'm not going to work with at all, which is not great. Whereas when we do it on the mat all together, I can differentiate at the point of individual needs because I know the range in my classroom. But what's most important is that I do IGH, and I don't pull out a text. Let's say I pulled out Mrs. Wishy-Washy, and I go, oh, there's SH, and there's some other sounds in there, and it becomes a lot more random. So it means that hand on heart, if I then hand my children onto you as the Year 3 teacher, you know what's been covered. And of course, it's not just about phonics, and that's one of the real misnomers around science of reading right now. Oh, it's just about phonics. No, it's not.
Yes,
we have a
absolutely.
vocabulary program as well. So if it's week 1 of term 3, we might all be doing words associated with Talk Like a Pirate Day, for example. And so if you're in one of the younger classes, you might be doing a word like scruffy. But if I'm in one of the upper classes, I might be doing skullduggery. And I'll be doing words associated with that theme, but we'll all be on the same track, if you like. So children will come out of primary school with about 1,200 Tier 2 words that they can not only read and spell, but that they use periodically in their writing. So, you know, when you're building something like that, we don't do it all at once because that's going to kill everybody. The schools that I work with, where we start with reading, and we always start with a day of professional learning on let's just come together. You know, you need to put everything that you learned at uni in your professional learning through a bit of a filter for rigour and evidence. And let me show you what the current research is showing. And there's a bit of bloodletting we talk about, well, you know, and I remind people, look, you know, when we know better, we do better. We just need to move on from this point now. We all need to move on together. And you know, one of the big challenges for teachers is, you know, we get very set in our ways. I like my certain resources and I don't ever chuck anything out. And that's the big problem. Sometimes I'll hang on to things that aren't so effective. So I have to point out to teachers, it's probably not a good idea to do this and that. So not a good idea to run decodable readers alongside predictive text because you need discrete strategies for each. And then that's a way of actually supporting teachers. So, you know, we might start with reading and then we roll into spelling, and then maybe the year after, because this isn't something that you do overnight because you will kill everybody and it's just too much. But the schools that I've worked with, I mean, it really only takes 2 to 3 years to become a turnaround school. And that means that your NAPLAN results goes from, you know, something that's not great to something that's outstandingly good. And you know, most of the schools that I work in, I mean, initially, you know, there's a lot of teachers who've been there a long time. And so don't take too kindly sometimes to being asked to do something different, and some leave, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
And some who stay, you know, will say, gosh, you know, I wish I had done this sooner. Because, as I said, every teacher wants their child to be successful, and they see it straight away in what their kids can do. And they'll say, my goodness, my students would have never been able to do this in year 2. Look at what they can do now. And the only thing that's changed is your instruction.
Have you found that with the low variation of the curriculum, so that's helped to build shared understandings across a teaching staff of what different sort of roles and responsibilities there are around executing that teaching? And then I have a second part to that question, and that is that the supporting resources to support that curriculum, you would want to also be, I'm going to say, fairly consistent in line with that curriculum. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I say as well, as I said, there's many scopes and sequences for phonics. You know, there's plenty of good product out there, but ultimately, and I'll borrow a term from a friend of mine, you know, I can raise the Titanic. I have worked with some pretty awful scope and sequences, and I've seen good teachers sink the ark because they don't know how to teach it. So it's not always just a scope and sequence. I think what you're really trying to do is to figure out what it is, get a game plan going. So yes, we're going to use this particular scope and sequence, and then you then drill down a little further. Carla, I get the opportunity to go into schools that aren't travelling well, and the principal will say to me, can you come and have a look, because I'm about to be reviewed and it's not going to go well. So best you tell me first, and then I'll be able to say to the reviewers that we've had a chat. And so, you know, I'll walk through classrooms and I'll see very little evidence of instruction. And I'll see news telling at 9 o'clock in the morning. And then one of the things that I often see are the timetables. And, you know, that's what I'll say to principals. That's the first thing you notice change, how teachers spend their time. So they start to become very aware of what they have to get through in the time that they have. And so they will start to establish timetables whereby, for example, it might be an 8:50 start in the morning, and the first 10 minutes will be on some activities just to get the kids going, come in, settle down, particularly in schools where there's some behaviour. And then the children might go for a 20-minute, 25-minute, which is moved to another classroom if you have to, spelling mastery lesson, because they'll be at different levels. And they come back to the main classroom, and then there'll be a daily review for reading. And it's pretty prescribed what's going to happen. And so when you start becoming highly accountable of your time, as a principal, you know that if you walk through at a certain time, you're likely to see particular practice. So those low variation curriculums are really helpful, particularly if you'll decide on your particular resource that you're going to use. One of the biggest challenges for teachers, of course, is around teacher knowledge. So just being handed something doesn't necessarily mean that you can teach it. So certainly in the schools that I work in, there's a lot of sharing and collaboration that goes on, because teachers realise that, like, you might be better at literacy than me. I'm pretty good at numeracy. So, you know, we do this in numeracy as well. I'll look after the slides for numeracy. You look after literacy. And of course, in bigger schools, you know, I might sit down one holiday and do all the vocabulary slides for my year level for a term, and then somebody else does it. And that's why incrementally you build this so that you don't kill everybody. But there's now, you know, so many schools in WA that there's a lot of collaboration that goes on between schools, which is marvellous as well.
Yeah, we're observing here in New Zealand that definitely that notion of the pilot schools really becoming, I'm going to say, readily available for others to go in and observe. And what we're seeing in those pilot schools, I'm going to say, is definitely that low variation of curriculum. We're seeing teachers who have really learned how to teach explicitly, and who do definitely have that collaboration and shared understanding of us, I guess, using a scope and sequence and the current research to build an evidence-based educational pathway that is consistent and we all know about, so that we're not in that self-employment position where this teacher is self-employed in this skill and this teacher is self-employed in this skill. Or I think that's a really exciting development here in New Zealand, and it's really great to sit back and reflect on where we're at. You know, you're a long way down the track, I think, compared to where we're at, but it's really nice for us, and I hope for the participants who are school leaders and driving this in their schools, to be able to sit back and hopefully nod and hear what you're saying and be very proud of the similarities in those points of practice.
I think you make a really important point. I get a lot of schools who will ring me and they'll say, oh, you know, we really want to do, you know, whatever. We want what that school down the road has got. And I'll say, well, you better go and have a look. Because, you know, I've had principals say to me, oh, my staff are very passionate about explicit instruction. I said, well, I'm very passionate about it too, but my explicit might not be your explicit. So,
absolutely.
You know, and just recently I've had the opportunity to work in a school, and so I said, oh, well, you better come and have a look. And the principal said, oh, you know, I don't know that all the teachers are going to be happy. I said, well, you know, bring someone along who isn't going to be happy, and that's the person's face I usually watch. And invariably there is some shock and awe, because this is a very different style of teaching. You know, this is not a style of teaching where in some states when I go, teachers teach from behind their desk. This is not a sit down type of teaching. This is a stand up type of teaching. You know, we don't do it all day, but when we do it, you know, we do go at a cracking pace, and it's the pace that is quite overwhelming for some people, because underpinning that pace, of course, is knowing the words to use, having schooled those young people in how to respond. One of my lovely graduates is in a high performing school in WA, and she sent me very kindly her maths daily review, which took the sum total of 14 minutes, and she covered a number of concepts. And I sat there this morning and took a tally and tried to figure out how she spent her time, and the children responded 148 times in 14 minutes. Now,
wow.
Well, sometimes it's faster than other, but on average, that's just about 5.5 times per minute. But in some periods of time during that sequence, they were responding 20 times a minute. So it varies. But when you look at the time on task, where the children's attention is, it was totally on her and on the different maths concepts that she revised. And that's just how she does it every day. And she's very good at it, and it's the only way she's ever taught. So the school is very fortunate, and I am, because of course people go and visit her and they have a look. And I know when they first look at it, Carla, they don't necessarily see what I see. So, you know, I deconstructed her lesson for her, and I'll use that as an activity, because it is so interesting when you look at the components. There's her knowledge of how to deliver it, and that's one thing. And then it's also her knowledge of how to present it, the content. So she knows she's got to start with skip counting, then she goes to times tables, then she goes to doubling numbers, then she goes to odd and even numbers, then she goes to place value, then she goes to, so she has a game plan in mind. So while we talk about that scope and sequence, you can drill down even further. And then she says, you know, I've done place value today. So that's kind of now, that's on the back burner for a week or two, because they're pretty good at that. And she's got all these other concepts that she's rolling through. So it changes every day. And of course, when you look at that as a teacher and think, oh my goodness, where am I going to get the time to do that? You start small. But, you know, it's good for people to see it done exceptionally well. So you as the principal and me as the teacher all know where we're headed. Otherwise, there can be misconceptions. I've gone into schools because principals have said, oh, no, they've read the book, they've read the Anita Archer's book, and they've read the Hollingsworth and Ybarra text, Explicit Direct. They've read those, they're good to go. And I've gone in there and quite clearly they don't know. So You've got to get the knowledge about how to teach.
That's right. Knowing and doing are two separate things, aren't they?
Yeah.
You know,
And I must admit,
it's good to know first.
Yeah, I've even had teachers say to me, I've got this book and I love this. And then I watch them teach and I think, well, I'm not sure which bit you've been reading because it's not the bit that I've been reading. And the actual enacted understanding is a whole different ballgame. That is hard sometimes for people, even the most, enthusiastic of teachers. It's just hard to change, and it's hard to do all these different things. There's a lot of balls in the air when you teach explicitly. And people will often sit back and go, wow, is that explicit instruction? Because, of course, I'm still dealing with all the myths, kids chained to desks, bored out of their school, all those things. And people go, wow, it's just so engaging and it's so fun and it's so interesting and it's so done really well. Because not done well, it's like anything not done well, and it takes a while to get to that point.
I've been thinking this for the last few minutes that you've been speaking, and it really is about the doing. And I on the back of what you're saying, I feel this kind of need to say to teachers that it is so important that they get to the point in time where they put the books down, they stop making resources, they stop searching for stuff, they stop reading readings, and they actually go and get on and teach. And they video their practice, and then they ask themselves, do I look like what I think I've read about? Do I look like what my peers are looking like? Do I look like other exemplary models of this type of practice? Because it's very, I guess what I'm observing at the moment in New Zealand is this sort of giant uptake of clutching for all of these different sources of information and making of resources and doing all of these bits. But at the end of the day, we've got to get on with the job, right? We've got to get on with the job. And the hardest part of this is changing our practice. First comes the belief, and then if we can move and shift into changing our practice and reflect on the impact of our practice, that will help embed that change in belief.
Oh,
we've got to see ourselves in action first.
I think you're so right. And it's funny, when you started then, I sort of had to think about myself because I put together a new unit at uni on the science of reading, and I just had everything. I had all the books. It was crunch time. And I thought, I've just got to organise this now, and I've got to get going with it. So I do know what that feels like. However, and I talked to my lovely colleague, Dr. Jennifer Buckingham, about these things, and we like to think about what's the least you actually need, because Carla, I don't know about you, but I didn't have any phonological awareness when I went to school, and I learned how to read via a phonic approach, because I'm old, and I just got it together with reading pretty fast, and so I look and I think there's a lot of product out there that, according to the research, you probably don't need as much of as you probably think you do. In fact, if I look at the intensity in which my student, now teacher Renee, was teaching in the video that I was watching this morning, the human brain is pretty good. It'll grab whatever it can and it'll get it together. So, I look at some of the commercial programs around phonological awareness, and phonological awareness is really, really important. But if it's not tied to reading and writing, then it's a pretty useless skill. So, we've got to look for efficient ways of doing it. And I know that if you're coming to this new as a teacher, you'll think, well, that's a great program. And you can have program. And then I know that a lot of teachers will be feeling really out of sorts around things like etymology and morphology. and they really are icing on the cake. And I look at the schools that I work in, and that they get the time that they deserve. And that's about 5 to 10 minutes a day, if that. And I know that for other teachers, they're trying to build entire programs around. And the reality is, with some words, knowing a bit of morphology is useful. With other words, it might be to do with etymology, but other words we can just decode. So I think that in that, as you described, in this enthusiasm, and of course, unfortunately, it's a commercial thing. So as soon as it's a commercial thing, I had a bookseller come to see me, and she said, oh, I'm having so much trouble moving these leveled readers. And I said, well, I can explain why. And she said, oh, no, we're going to be doing our own decodable series. And I'm like, yeah, so many decodable series out there, and a lot of them you get for free. And I had my lovely colleague, Alison Clark, on recently. Go to her website, they're free. But people buy into these. And suddenly they're very constrained. And I really think that sometimes we kill ourselves to do everything. And if you look at structured literacy, they go, yeah, it's about phonology, it's about semantics, it's about morphology. Yeah, it is. But you know what? Let's just get them reading first. And then we can gradually take on board some of those other things, because you're running the risk of losing the fidelity of what it's all about.
Absolutely.
Think about what is the science of reading actually telling us? It's saying that this human brain of ours is really not there for reading, it's there for talking, and we have to repurpose bits of it that previously did other jobs and get them to do reading. Well, how do they do reading? Well, they need lots of practice. And so you go back to a little bit of PA linked very closely to decoding and encoding. So as soon as they can read it, they spell it, go back the other way. And that starts to develop that reading system in the brain. And then let's not confuse the matter by still running predictive text. Let's just keep that diet of early decoding. As soon as possible, let's push back from those decodables and get into more natural quality literature with words that kids can decode in there, because that brain's pretty good. With a bit of help, it'll get there. And then we get that, as Mark Seidenberg says, that velocity takeoff for reading. And I see that happen so much now in schools without kind of killing ourselves along the way. And that's always the problem, isn't it? I mean, there's so much enthusiasm now for, science and reading. It frightens me a little bit, because I don't want people to go, right, what's next? What's next? So we've done the science of reading. I've had principals say to me, and John Hattie is a friend and a colleague of mine, saying, yep, well, we've done visible learning now, so we're moving on to the next. So you don't do visible learning in 12 months. You don't do science of reading in 6 months or 12 months. It's something that just has to become part of your embedded practice, because, of course, that's what the research is telling us right now. And you know what? If something new comes on the horizon, and we now know that, that when you come to, say, sight words, which is a big issue, like we now know what a sight word is. It's any word, every word wants to grow up to be a sight word. That's the meme. So we know that, sometimes you're just going to have to learn those words like I and the. When you're very little, we're just going to have to learn those, probably by sight and by spelling them. And then there's a lot where we can decode and we can bond the sounds and the spellings to those words. And there might be some down the track that are useful around etymology. So that's something new that's come to the table. So I hope that we can continue to grow that body of knowledge without thinking that suddenly we're just going to stop doing that and do something else, because, that pendulum swing is such a truism.
Absolutely.
We're always moving.
It is.
Next. Yeah. You don't want that happening.
I think what I've observed is very much in line with sort of what you're saying and what you were suggesting from John Hattie, is that as professionals, it's really important that we take the information on and then we kind of layer it, and we understand that what we're learning becomes part of our pedagogy, as opposed to we just use some of these things that we're learning also at an isolated time during the day. Because what I'm observing happen in these really great pilot schools across New Zealand is that these teachers are beginning to realise that the knowledge and skill they're learning through the research of the science of reading and then implementing structured literacy, that actually that occurs right across the curriculum wherever language is present.
You're right.
So it's been wonderful to observe that increasing confidence that comes to branch outside just, implementing a scope and sequence, or just teaching with decodable readers, or just learning to teach about phonological awareness and irregular words. We're starting in New Zealand to see this kind of big umbrella wrap around all of those things, and the syntax and semantics and syllable division and all that stuff, and teachers just having that in their toolbox right across the board, which it's pretty awesome to observe that in these, what I'm going to say, like to take your term, I know you have this as an actual scoring system, but in high performing schools.
You're right. And I think that when I work with schools, as I said, we start with reading and we bed down reading, because there's no point starting with anything else. Otherwise, you've got kids in year 3, 4 who can't read. So we start with reading and get that right, then roll into spelling. And of course, many teachers that I work with who are products of the university that they went through and the schools that they attended prior to that have not been taught how to teach spelling. don't know spelling rules. And I was a secondary English teacher before I started working with little kids, and my response, and I was a very good speller and a very good writer, so my response to your bad spelling would just be to circle it and write it out in red and say, come on, Carla, do better. Whereas these days I can explain spelling rules, and the ease at which they roll off my tongue is not lost on me, because I can still remember a good friend of mine who's a speech pathologist and an audiologist coming to uni probably 20 years ago and just trotting out these spelling rules. And I was like, wow. And so I know that that's new knowledge for me. So when I work with a new school, I know teachers don't have that knowledge. And in a perfect world, what I'm hoping is through the following of the scope and sequence and the gradual introduction of knowledge. So if you look at Dawson Park Primary School, which is the school that you visited, we started with reading, then we rolled into spelling, and then we thought, well, we really need to do something about writing. And, at Dawson Park, writing is in the service of knowledge, which comes from Judith Hockman's work, and it's also at a sentence level. And sentence level grammar sends most people, including the children, weak at the knees, let alone the teachers. So we come up with a system for dealing with that. And then, of course, you don't want the kids just writing about what's going on in their lives, because that's not that interesting. So we then give them the vocabulary. And so, vocabulary is something that you do towards the end. And then what you hope by that stage is that teachers have then got enough knowledge of how to teach spelling. And so a scripted program like Spelling Mastery will do that, to be able to look at a word and go, okay, so there's a spelling rule in there I think I can explain to the children. At the very least, I'm going to be able to break that word down into sounds and syllables. We might be able to have a look at the syllables in that word and figure out whether it's an open or a closed syllable. And then and so you hope you give them the tools so that, again, much like the phonic little readers, we move away from those and we move into any word. So any word can be part of what we then teach, and hopefully we then arrive at a point where the kind of instruction or the content is no different to what it's always been. It's just we have much higher levels of teacher knowledge around being able to teach it explicitly.
Yeah. I completely agree. And just like you say, that's not lost on you when you are in that, what I think is a somewhat privileged position, to be able to sit next to a student or a group of students and explain that. I myself, as someone who's been a school principal and at that time didn't know all those spelling rules, I was like you and could spell anything growing up, but I couldn't ever explain anything when I would come across that work of students where there were errors. And I must say, the sense of confidence and the sense of empowerment that I feel, Lorraine, when I can do that is, I feel so proud of that. I feel so proud and so very grateful that I am able to explain and not make excuses or say, I don't know, you find out for yourself, or let's look it up here or Google it or whatever. It is incredibly empowering for teachers. So let's sit in that place now of you perhaps sharing some insights as to what has this instruction done in terms of raising teacher knowledge and confidence. What have you seen? What have you experienced in your research? What did you experience in all that great work you've done in the Kimberley with, empowering those teachers and filling them with knowledge and then in turn confidence?
Well, go back to that 10% rule, okay? Because you have to give them everything. And I'm working with seasoned campaigners who've been in the Kimberley, and I did in my first year in the Kimberley meet a gentleman in a safari suit. That's something that only a certain age group of people will appreciate. But he graduated from uni in the 1970s, and not only did he maintain his style of dress, but that was the way he and actually wasn't a bad teacher. I mean, back in the 70s, reading was pretty good. But then I've obviously met teachers along the way who have been, say, the reading recovery specialist, the literacy coordinator. And so they've had plenty of years to embed their practice, good, bad, or indifferent. So going in and working with those teachers is interesting because I know that everybody's coming from a different place. I also know that the thought of doing something different. I mean, one teacher said to me, when I met you and I went to that PD that you did, I thought I'd just lie down till the urge passed, because I have outlived everything else in this place and I can outlive you as well. And she's now a great advocate for what we do in the Kimberley. And she said, but then, you know, you came back. And I said, yeah, I did. And I said to her, hey, so how are we going teaching reading the way we did in the professional learning? And she's like, well, I don't remember. That's okay. Let me show you. Let me show you. You see, and in the Kimberley, I have 24 schools. I have 8 coaches. So the maths on that is very good, which means that we will come in and support you. If you can't remember, that's okay, Carla. I'll come and do it for you again. And moreover, I will leave for you a bespoke PowerPoint to help you. And next time, I'm going to come back in 2 days and I'm going to watch you do that PowerPoint. And if you don't feel confident, we're going to do it together. So we're very kind, but we're very insistent. And I guess we also have schools now that now do this. So as we do in Perth, it's now an expectation upon employment that you will be coached and we will give you a scope and sequence and we need you to follow it. Otherwise, go somewhere else and be happy. So it's kind of, it's always, for me, it's very much a carrot. You know, we will give you all the professional learning and the support that we can possibly give you. Of course, I'm very privileged to teach at uni. So I run 2 units in the final semester, which is optional. Students choose them, but they choose them in droves, which is great. And I work with some very talented colleagues and we show them how to teach spelling. And so even though they don't know it all, because you can't take it all in, it takes a long time.
No, it does.
They now know what they don't know. And that's very powerful because, you know, I'm a little over meeting grads who think they know everything. And unfortunately, I think that's part of a generation as well. And, you know, I know that I don't know everything. So a little bit of humility goes a long way. But I can now provide to the Kimberley some stunning beginning teachers. They are fantastic and they understand what the job is. They know that perhaps they don't know everything, but they're going up there for 4 days of professional learning. And so it's not as challenging for them because prior to going to a school or the Kimberley or anywhere, they've seen videos, they know what it looks like. So they have an understanding of what they're up for. For people who have never seen it before, it can be quite intimidating, and I really do feel for them because it's a bit like if, say, for example, someone came along very influential and said, look, Carla and Lorraine, don't be doing that structured literacy anymore. You're much better off getting the children to do a bit of macrame, sit in the corner and hum, you know, kumbaya. They're going to learn how to read that way. You and I are going to go, oh, no, well, that doesn't feel right. Irrespective of the fact that we think the weight of research is behind us, we're not going to take to it. And so I'm very mindful of that teacher. And so I know that their confidence can take an absolute hammering because they've been doing things a certain way. And, you know, it's a bit like folding your arms, try the other way, it doesn't feel right. So it was hard initially. But what I found is an enormous sense once they have got this knowledge and they feel very empowered to support their students. And then, you know, they will say to me, oh, and I've introduced the writing revolution and I'm dabbling with this and I've purchased this book and Nancy Hennessy's new book on reading comprehension's marvellous. And you can see that it has opened their eyes to what the possibilities are. And of course now, you know, if you go onto the Science of Reading in Schools Facebook page, there's just so many resources on there. I mean, some of them perhaps are better than others. So we need people to still be very discerning consumers, but there is a community out there and there's access to research as well. So that is only going to want you to feel like you are a better teacher. So people's confidence does grow. I've also had teachers say to me, you know, back in the day, and one of my colleagues went to one of the other universities in Perth, and at the time they were well known as sort of the buffet approach. They go, well, Carla, there's actually 10 ways to teach reading. You see which one feels best for you. Like you would know at the age of 21, you know, the best way to teach reading, but it was all about how it felt for you, which we now know isn't what we would say. We'd say, let's look at what the research says and do what that says. You know, and so my colleague going out into schools said, I had no idea for the first 12 months what I was doing. Absolutely no idea. That's not great. So a lot of teachers leave teaching because they don't feel successful. Whereas I know that any new grad coming into the schools in the Kimberley or even going into Canberra now into one of those schools is going to be handed a curriculum that says, okay, this is what we need you to do. And you can bite off bits to start off with, but we're all starting with reading, then we'll move into spelling. And you know what? In a few years' time, we'll teach you how to teach the schwa. You know, if you really want to stick with this, we'll get to the schwa later. But just right now, but we're going to give you these things and get you going. And I think that's very empowering.
Yes. It is. And I think I'm sure you would agree with me too when I say that when we come from that place, there's a real sense of sort of dropping the overwhelm for teachers, because from a workload perspective, they are so much better catered for, you know, from that whole well-being and looking after them. When we have that curriculum that in that beginning has low variation and teachers are provided the knowledge, they do have a scope and sequence, they know the direction, but ultimately they know the why, and then they're given or, you know, co-construct the how. Gosh, that's such a privileged place for them to be in.
Yeah, and you'd like to think that in any other field of endeavour, that's how it would be. You know, yes. I have the joy of getting on some very small planes. Sometimes it's just me and Troy, okay, the pilot. It's the most expensive Uber you can ever catch. And I marvel at the fact that, you know, he's got his checklist, and I'm sure he's done this for many, many years, but he still goes back to his checklist. So when you look, and there's a great article by Atul Gawande, who's a New York a surgeon, and he calls it the checklist manifesto. Well, you know what? It is a checklist, because if I was suddenly to go and teach year one somewhere, which I'd love to do, I think I'll be rubbish at maths, but good at literacy. I'll be okay at literacy. You know, I would like to think that I had a scope and sequence to follow, because otherwise there's a good chance I'm going to neglect something. I'm not going to necessarily teach everything that I have to teach. And I think it takes away the thought of thinking on Sunday night, geez, what am I going to do with them tomorrow? You know, I better grab Mrs. Wishy-Washy and we'll just do a little bit of, you know, analytic phonics on the run and hope something sticks. Yeah. Well, you know, we know that's not the best way to go.
And knowing what I know now, it really scares the bejeebers out of me, thinking back to my days as a school principal, when I think back to how much did you really know was going on in here and was going on in here and was going on in here. And I just think, gosh, it's, you know, the polar opposite of that is the excitement that I experience from school leaders when they really have true visibility. And at a certain point, at various times of the day, and I have one incredible school leader who springs to mind, who's become a very good friend of mine. She can tell you exactly what is being taught in each and every one of those classrooms at different times of the day, and actually right down to what will be happening in terms of literacy. Yeah, it's amazing, and that's how it should be, right? If we're going to move these children forward and support these teachers to be the best teachers they can be.
Yeah, and I really, you're right. You know, part of the challenge for me, and if I put my learning difficulties hat on, and I know that's true to your hat as well. You know, I had a mum who's a student of mine actually contact me, and it's now the second time she's concerned about her daughter, and she sent me some writing samples, and it's not great. And I know that an hour of tuition a week is just not enough. But if it was done every day, and I think of her daughter in some of the classrooms that I work in, you know, we've pretty well eradicated any phonological problems now. But we're dealing with the pointy end kids, the ones who do have the working memory issues and the double deficits. You know, most kids are doing okay now in terms of the business of teaching reading. And if you think about it, reading's the easy one. You know, spelling and writing are the hard ones.
Yeah.
So I worry still that there is unfortunately a lottery in place. I know the good schools, and I'd like to think that they have got an embedded curriculum now and enough teacher knowledge. And certainly when I go to the Kimberley, you know, I say to the communities that I go into, you know, this is actually for you to say, you know, I've had to go and teach in places where some of the children are really challenging, quite rambunctious, you might say. And I often have, you know, 20 people wandering to see this wondrous thing. What's she going to do? And I don't know the kids at all. And I've got to wrangle them, and I can. And, you know, my instruction is what I'm good at. And, you know, I'll have camp dogs wandering in as well. It's quite interesting. And often, you know, there's local elders, traditional owners will come in and they'll look at me and they'll go, yeah, proper teaching. Yeah, proper teaching. And a lot of the older community members can read and write really well because they lived through a period of time in instruction when we got it right. And unfortunately, sometimes their children, even their grandchildren aren't in a good place because we didn't get the instruction right. And I think, well, that's got to be owned by somebody. That's because education, as you know, fads come and go, and for all we know, somebody could suggest that macrame is the way to go down the track. And you think, well, you need people like parents to say, no, we actually know that this works. And we need teachers to go, you know what, this is effective. We know why we're doing what we're doing. It hasn't been imposed on us. We know why. The research is there. And if we keep doing this, we'll get a really good result. So, it's that sticking to a game plan. And those original schools that I talked about, most of them have remained in that same way. They are still high-performing schools. We've had some leadership changes at a couple of the others, and that's been quite devastating because it takes you probably a good 3 years to build it up and about 6 months to dismantle. And so when a principal comes along and says, oh, it doesn't feel right, I didn't have any problems learning how to read and write, my kids are going great, do what you like. The good teachers who were always part of the journey go off somewhere else because they can't live under that regime. And then you'll often find that it just unravels really quickly. And that's a terrible thing. And unfortunately in education, it's probably the worst thing about being in education. You're constantly starting over. And it's a shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really is a shame when we do that.
What I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump onto our page and see if anybody has any questions for you.
Sure.
And while I'm doing that, if you could just be thinking about what would one sort of last message, other than any questions that anybody has popped up onto the thread. So I'm just going to jump in here and see if I can do this. Sometimes people ask questions and other times they don't. So let's have a look. So if you are listening in with us live, please feel free to jump in and ask a question. If you have a question that you'd like for me to ask Dr. Hammond, I can certainly do that for you. So just bear with me. A little bit tricky when I'm just working on the one screen. Here we go. Okie dokie. All right, so let's see what we've got. Okay, here we go. So the first question that we've got is, oh yes, we need Dr. Hammond here, please. Most definitely agree with that. That's very kind, isn't it? But what we also have is where to start when using explicit and direct instruction. What would be your sort of go-to piece of advice for those people potentially who are just starting out? What would you recommend for them?
Okay, well, there are good materials out there. So the least expensive is to look up Barack Rosenshine and find his Principles of Instruction, because that's free. Then if you look at something called the Daily Review, that's been the game changer in Western Australia and certainly in the Kimberley. It quells behaviour because when kids aren't busy, it's fertile ground for misbehaviour, and you get a bit of pace going. So the idea behind a daily review is that if you were doing one for literacy, you would follow the simple view of reading, and you start off with a little bit of PA, and then you'd roll straight into some phonics, and then we do some decoding of words, and we'd use regular words, irregular words, non-words, and then fluency around those words, and then maybe little sentences. And then we do a little bit of vocabulary, and then we'd have a little bit of comprehension to end off. So that's a very simple structure to follow, and it can get more complicated. But step one, if you're going to teach explicitly, is you have to bed down your content. You have to think, where am I going to end up at the end of that 15-minute block, or however long it's going to take you? And if you've got a little passage in mind, whether it's a decodable reader, or for older children, it's a bit of a more natural piece of text, or it might be a little passage out of Roald Dahl's novel, The Twits. You've decided what you're going to end up on. You work backwards and you go, okay, so if the kids are going to read that and understand it, maybe there's some vocabulary in there I should be referring to. So that then tells you what to put into vocab. And then you think, right, well, gosh, there's some words in there that are 2-syllable words ending in LE, little, turtle. So maybe I could revise that, and I could have them spell some words. And there's a bunch of high frequency words in there. Some of them are regular, some are irregular. Best I revise those when I'm doing my fluency. And gee, I can see that there's some letter combinations in there the students might struggle with. So suddenly it gives you a framework. Otherwise, we can have a little bit of a confetti approach where it's really random. And we start with reading comprehension, then we do a few homonyms, and then we go over here and we do something else. And that's one of the things I try to get teachers to do. Like, think about the last thing you want them to do, because, you know, a daily review is underpinned by old school task analysis. Where do you want the kids to end up? Work backwards. And then that helps you, so you're not spending, you haven't got 1,000 slides, your computer's not knocking its knees when it opens up. You know, you've got what we call template slides. So we've got some slides where we can swap out information. So the slides always look the same. You might have 3 different backgrounds. I've got my Cat in the Hat background. I've got my Finding Nemo background. And the kids think, oh, this is different. It's not, it's the same. But it looks different. It just means I can swap in and out that information. So that's a really good place to start. Start with Barack Rosenshine, because
that's brilliant.
It well. Number 1 and number 10, daily review and periodic review. So we don't go, well, Carla, you're probably good with the 1-1-1 doubling rule. I won't be bothering doing that again. No, it'll take you 5 years to get your head around that one. So I know that if we did it today, I'm going to revise it tomorrow. And then I'm going to revise it the day after. And I'm going to leave it for about 5 days. And, it's going to turn up again. And so if you look at the best of direct instruction materials like Spelling Mastery, it does all the remembering for you. Suddenly, that concept turns up again. There it is again. It's got that retrieval practice there. So the kids are constantly having to think about it.
That's so powerful. I know for us, when we've been developing our material for the Ideal platform, that whole nature of it being truly systematic and cumulative has been really important. How do schools assist those students who take longer to learn?
Well, how are you going to assist anybody? It's through repetition and practice. So, I think about, the mum who contacted me, her kid's behind. She's probably going to jump in at home and have to do spelling mastery with her own child, which is not great. I'm not a big advocate for any parent having to work with their own child. Kids, I think the thing to remember is that kids don't necessarily learn that differently. We've all got the same brain. We all do it the same way, because as soon as we start going down the track of going, well, Carla, you're a bit special. You try, you're probably more sort of visual spatial, and I'm certainly more into interpretive dance. And then you've got, the kid over there who's suddenly we've got into a situation where we're thinking that the way that you learn is different to how I learn. The science of learning is pretty clear on that. It says, look,
it is.
Got this information processing model. We struggle to take on board too much content. The majority of kids who have issues around literacy and numeracy have it around automaticity for letter sounds, times tables. This is something that we can build up their surface level knowledge on. So for the kids who do take a bit longer, and certainly all of the schools that I work in are representative of the full range. We have young people in there with intellectual disability right the way through to gifted kids. They all benefit from exactly the same. They just need more opportunities to practice. And I can't think of a better way of doing that than teaching them explicitly. You might find, and what I've found in the schools that I work in, is that sometimes we inherit kids around about year 3, year 4, who may have been, instructional refugees from other schools, and they will come in, and so they need a second dose. And so what we'll do is we'll leave them in their classroom in the morning, but in the afternoon they'll be pulled out for a second dose of exactly the same thing, delivered by somebody different, not a completely different program. And that often is enough just to bring them up to speed with their peers.
And have that repetition. That's exactly what we're observing again in our high performing schools, is 2 things. One, the alignment of any extra practice. So we're not, feeding them cheese here and then taking them out and feeding them chocolate somewhere else. So that alignment. And the second thing is most definitely providing those opportunities for repetition or else front loading, so that you're preparing them before they're going to get it. So kind of that double dose situation. Okay, 2 more questions. One is around where is the best place to get support or schools to visit in New South Wales?
Oh, New South Wales. Well, I don't want to put the people on the spot, but if you don't all do it at once, but if someone sends me an email, I have been supporting a number of schools in New South Wales, and I'm sure that they'd be up for a visit if asked nicely. There certainly are some good schools.
Sure. So what we'll do is at the end of the chit chat, I'll give our contact details, and then we can give out your
that would be great.
email.
Thank you.
So that you don't get so bombarded with that question. And our last question, which is quite a big one, but as succinctly as you can, what might daily review look like in writing?
Oh, well, first of all, you've got to break down the concepts that you're going to teach. So let's imagine, as you said, you use the term front load. So I'm about to get the students to do, so they're about to be writing a narrative or a persuasive. So in the schools that I work in, we have a very clear structure for both of those things. So a narrative isn't a case of saying, hey, Carla, just write a story. It's saying, okay, Carla, so for the first paragraph of your narrative, you're going to have 5 sentences. The first is going to be starting with dialogue. Then the second sentence is going to include a simile. And then the third sentence is going to include, and so I'll give you the vocab words as well. So if I then have to get you to do that, I'm going to step back and go, right. So my daily review for writing is always going to start off with, depending on the level of the students, what a simple sentence looks like. Capital letter, one idea, end punctuation if they're little. And then we can get into a who and a what it did when they're a little bit older. So we'll go back over sentence structure, which means that we're going to have capital letters, end punctuation. If, like me, you're a devotee of the writing revolution, Judith Hockman says in your paragraph, you cannot have the same end punctuation in the first and the last sentence. So suddenly it's like, oh, I've suddenly got to make my writing a tiny bit more interesting. If I'm wanting to do narrative, I'm probably going to be doing some work around adjectives. If the children are older, then I'm going to have figurative language in there as well in my daily review. So we've already determined that we better go back over dialogue because nobody's great at that. So I'm going to review dialogue, the key aspects of using dialogue and what to include. We're going to practice some of that before we then get to do that end task, which again, working backwards, is going to be the narrative. And there's a very clear structure to follow, and that'll be for each of the paragraphs. So the daily review for writing for me will just contain those subcomponents. So if we're going to be talking about adjectives, we're going to be finding the noun in the sentence. Because if you can't find the noun, you can't do the adjective. Again, with the verb, we're going to be looking then for the adverb. So that's going to tell me that I'm going to have to go back over those particular concepts. Because writing is the hardest thing we ask kids to do, I'm then probably going to be doing some work around spelling. So I know that I want kids to use words, so I'm going to be spelling some vocab words that I'm hoping that they're going to be using. So exactly the same principle, think about where you're going to end up and then work backwards. So what you're trying to do is to tie down as many bits of the writing process that make it that incredible neurological juggle. So the kids go, oh, I'm good. I've got dialogue under control, so I can do direct speech. I've got that under control. I've got some great words to use. I've got a structure to follow. I know what a simile and a metaphor is. And so they can then write to that particular structure. Of course, the goal being down the track, we just take that structure away. But you and I both know a narrative needs roughly 5 sentences, should contain some of the following in the first paragraph, and we're good to go.
Absolutely brilliant. We have an amazing wee poster, our Building Blocks of Writing Success, that is a follow-up to this chit chat. I'm going to ensure is available for participants to follow up on that question when you talk about all of those components. It will just help to, so I'm going to get our team to make sure that's a free download on our website for people to be able to access, just to be able to continue that conversation of all those components. Wow, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. What would be your final message or your wish for the teachers and leaders across New Zealand and the parents as they continue to advocate for and support the implementation of the science of reading and structured literacy?
I think for a teacher, if you think about what a teacher does in a classroom, and I do this in my university teaching as well, I like to stop and think and say to myself, what are the students thinking about at this particular moment? because it's all about the focus of attention. So if I'm teaching a unit, which I just have, and all my units start off with a 10-minute daily review, and you can only imagine the look of horror on my students' faces when they come in and realise the desks are actually in rows. They can't drag a desk down to the back corner of the room and get out their chips and their laptop and kind of wait for the floor show to start. They are actually sitting in rows, and I have all their names on pop sticks as well. And also they have a whiteboard that they're going to be working with a partner with, and it's quite confronting for students in that regard. But I say to them, look, I'm actually trying to teach you something here, guys, and what I'm hoping is in the time that we have together, I'm going to teach you in such a way that I am going to focus your attention in on what it is we're doing. You've come to university. I know more about this than you. I'm very interested in what you think about it. I'm very interested about your journey. But ultimately, I kind of know more than you in this regard. The same way that if I was to take up tennis, I know nothing about tennis. I'd probably choose, Roger Federer to help me. Not my husband, who's useless at tennis. So, you think about that. How are they spending their time? What are they doing? And what are they thinking about? Because, let's pull it right back to that science of reading. Are they actually putting letters and sounds together at pace to decode words? So those words become suddenly so familiar that the brain goes, I've got this, it's okay, I can read that word. And that's all to do with time on task. And it's such a boring thing to talk about, but it's how you spend their time.
Thank you so much. That is an incredibly powerful message to finish with. For those of you that have joined us for this chit chat this afternoon, thank you so much for your commitment to being a better teacher, a better leader, or an influencer in this area that is much needed across New Zealand and in other countries. We'll be back here in August with a chit chat from another expert. Until then, we will say good afternoon.